Hello, I'm Dr. Harriet Fraad.
And hello, I'm Julianna Forlano, here with our podcast, Capitalism Hits Home.
This is a show about the intersections of capitalism with race, gender, and the entire spectrum of our personal lives.
We aim to educate, activate, and maybe even alleviate some of the burdens we all experience living in a capitalist USA.
We hope that we can serve you really well. We're brought to you by Democracy at Work. And this is the second part of our show today on the death throes, we sure hope, of toxic masculinity as shown by the militia groups.
We'll be getting to the headlines in a moment, but right now, as we always like to start, we thought we'd briefly share with you how capitalism has hit us at home last week. Harriet, is it okay if I start? I've got a burning desire.
Sure
here.
is. Yes, you go.
Okay, well, this is my marshmallow story. I went to the store, grocery store, bought some marshmallows to bring home to my daughter because I am looking for creative things to do. And we have a fireplace. And so roasting marshmallows on the fireplace as it gets colder is something we can do at home. That's interesting. You know how it is to be a mom. You're always kind of looking. So I bought the marshmallows, I brought them home, and she was overjoyed. So much so that she took the bag of marshmallows and put them in her mouth. She didn't open them. It was like the whole bag. And I freaked out, had an overreaction because I was just at the grocery store and it's COVID and COVID can get on the bag. Who knows who sneezed on it? And I just, in a brief moment, one moment, because we're not dealing with this pandemic, I flipped out. I was like, hey, take that out of your mouth. And she didn't do it because she's 4 and they don't listen, so she wanted to do it more. And I my response to her finally got the bag out of her mouth, but I got to thinking about it afterwards. And the fact that Donald Trump is prioritizing making $1 by selling off our PPE and waiting until we can make it at some company where he's going to make money, waiting a vaccine. He doesn't want to interact with the scientific community internationally to make the best vaccine the fastest. He wants a U.S. vaccine. All of that, it creates this atmosphere in the home that sort of stacked down onto that moment in my parenting where the fear of this coronavirus just went to my daughter, and she got a ridiculous overreaction from her, from her point of view. It's marshmallows in a bag. What's the problem? And I just, I felt bad about it. Harriet, please make me feel better. But at the same time, it was like, this isn't all me. I live in a system that is affecting us here at home. So that's what came to me this week.
And what came to me is really an extension of what came to you, which is I am a therapist and I do remote therapy from home. And my clients have a level of anxiety and terror over what they fear is an impending coup by Trump's minions, who will try to so disturb the elections that the Supreme Court will rubber stamp him and put him in office, even though he is not elected by the American people. And they're in a state of high anxiety. Suicides are spiking, hotlines are out of control, and people are terrified. And so that's what hit me this week in my job and at home.
I can see why. I wonder, we're recording on Election Day. I wonder where the people are right now as they're watching this video and what is happening. And, my understanding is we're in for a bumpy ride for at least the next month as Trump tries to buck the inevitable as people vote in droves for Joe Biden, and he tries to undermine that vote. So I guess more than us, intrepid viewers.
Yes, you do.
But there are also some news stories out there, Harriet. What struck you that's in the news?
What struck me in the news is very much of an extension of what's striking me as a therapist at home, which is that the Daily News headline today, November 3rd, is that America is now having the most divisive, most anxiety producing election in its history because people are terrified. It's not just, one capitalist clown versus another capitalist clown. It's a whole extension of violence and prejudice and toxic masculinity that people fear. So
Harry, do you mind
that
if I
story
ask
hit
you,
me.
do you mind if I ask you, how does it affect you as a therapist as your clients come in with this heightened level of anxiety? Do you get secondary traumatization? Like, how can you hold the whole world of terror that people are bringing in because of the capitalist system and what it has brought us to in this moment?
Well, what allows me to hold it is I do feel, as Rebecca Solnit writes, there is hope in the dark. I do feel that Trump is organizing his opposition, that more people are striking, more people are opposing, more people are joining than have joined for 50 years, that all sorts of organizations are forming where people realize we need power with rather than against one another. And that is so hopeful that it's a buffer against people's anxiety.
That's a great lead into the story that affected me this past little while, and I just want to piggyback on what you said. Is that I mean, I'm hooked up with a bunch of activists because that's part of this work. That's part of my job. And just knowing that people are doing work, I think is very empowering. You don't really see it reported on as much as I wish we would because the media doesn't want us empowered. That's let's do a whole nother show on that. But here's the news story that I bring. 121 organizations are urging the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the director there, Dr. Robert Redfield, to declare a national moratorium on water shutoffs. I don't know if you know about this, but of course, the U.S. has coronavirus cases and deaths spiking on the rise, continued uncertainty over another congressional COVID-19 relief packages, ongoing. There are these advocacy groups, which are spearheaded by people I love, Food and Water Watch. They are demanding a nationwide moratorium on water service disconnections for non-payment during the COVID-19 pandemic, with safe service restoration for all households who were previously disconnected. Now, when I found out about this story, I found out through the fact that these people were doing activism, but I was so aggrieved by the fact that this is even a story that water, which is necessary for life because you have to pay for it, is getting shut off during a pandemic when one would argue that washing things like hands and bodies is more important than ever. My head was about to explode when I read this. But the fact is that these folks are working alongside the Center for Biological Diversity, the corporate accountability folks, Earth Justice, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, I could go on, Public Citizen. And they're working to make sure that those water shutoffs end. So I'm keeping an eye out for how that campaign is going. But it is pretty great that the organizations are all coming together for this mutual work.
It sure is. It's very inspiring because basically the basic needs of life should not be profited off and cut off. And those are healthy food, clean air, clean water, and warmth, i.e., electricity and utilities, should be free. People can make money off of other things, but not the necessities of life. And people cut off from life necessities because they don't have money. That's inhumane.
Harriet Fraad, it is a joy to do this podcast with you. We are going to transition into part 2 of our discussion that we had last week about toxic masculinity and the intersection with Trump and the militia groups that we see going on now. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy the second part of our discussion.
When Robert O'Neill, I'll read from this story, the former Navy SEAL who claims to have been the one to shoot Osama bin Laden, he tweeted a maskless photo of himself on a Delta flight. And it's captioned, "I'm not a pussy," okay? Because he's not wearing a mask. It wasn't enough of a manly thing to kill Osama bin Laden. He had to not wear a mask to show that he didn't want to protect life, because that's what his manhood was about. And I think it's about a group of men who don't want to give up the privilege they got from the higher salaries they used to get and just be people, which would unite us in a way that's loving and fine. So
that these people, I think toxic masculinity should be put in the DSM as a mental disorder, because I think some of it actually is passed down through generations and isn't just specifically about how they got screwed by the capitalist system. And I go back to, I know we're kind of in part 2 of our discussion here. And in part 1, I talked about having to put my cat to sleep as how capitalism affects that. And of course, I'm remembering back to having to put a cat to sleep when I was in my early 20s. And the cat was still, not to go on a crazy cat binge here, but and the cat was living at home with my parents. And neither one of them, not my father either, who was Italian, Southern Italian, brought up with this concept of machismo. He couldn't bring himself to take the cat to be put to sleep. And he was the one who would always bring the animals home. My mother's like, I don't want to take care of another thing. But my father would be like, look at this cute, the kitten. You know, he had a very strong accent. And so I've been thinking about this and reliving some of my trauma around what happened, because when I was leaving the house with that cat that I went and took and put to sleep, he left and went way up in our garden. Couldn't be there for when I was removing the cat. And then later on, after the cat had been put to sleep, we all, 2 days later, I don't know, we went to the local park and ran across someone we knew. And then my father shamed me for having come. They said, oh, what are you doing here? I thought you were in college or wherever. My father said, oh, she came home to put the cat to sleep. Can you believe that? And I had been mad about it this whole time until I started thinking about this idea of he wasn't allowed to have his feelings of softness, grief, love for the cat, which he obviously had. He just wasn't allowed to have that. And I feel like that's really sad. And it gets in the way of people being able to be intimate, and intimacy is kind of what heals everybody. What stops violence. It's what tamps down these militia groups. And so there's that psychological part where the militia group people, you can't excuse the behavior because they're choosing it. But at the same time, they're also probably victims of having been victimized, which helps me when I drive past their Nazi Trump flags, be like, okay, they have a problem, but how can we fix it societally? How can we support them putting down their rifles and guns and just being okay with having a soft feeling about something?
Yeah, well, because they have a masquerade of strength, because they don't have any. They've been, in their own eyes, unmanned because they can't support dependent wives and children. And that is a sad vision of masculinity that used to be dominant in the United States and is being challenged as both people need to be together. But also, there is a sense of fearing your own weakness. And what they see as weakness is emotion, caring about other people, caring about life enough not to do your own thing and not be masked, but think of everyone else and be kind.
And this brings us right back to capitalism. And this program is brought to you by Democracy at Work, which works to help people understand how and get the idea of how we could have a more democratic workplace than just like some guy owns it. And then there's a bunch of people on the board and they make a lot of money and they make decisions that might undermine you who do all the work to support this company. It's the same story. You've heard us tell it before. But this idea of power could be for men and women, could be engendered if people had a democratic say in their workplace environment. So capitalism and the structure of capitalism is what causes these men to not have a say, not have a sense of true power, true personal power, true integrity, makes them feel impotent, even if they have a job still. They're still impotent. They don't get to vote on whether making the product goes to China. They don't get a say in whether when they make a product, it poisons the water that their children have to drink. If they were able to have democratization in their workplace, this would give them that sense of power that they seek, but power in a real way that's actually valid and useful and not going to be used to abuse someone else.
Anyone. It's power with others rather than power over others, which changes from toxic masculinity is power over. These men have a chance to have power with other men and women together, but they're choosing this hyper masculinist masquerade of strength because they're made impotent on their jobs where they have no say, and in their country where the politicians are often bought. And they don't want to admit it. They want to suck up and kick down on women and minorities and posture as strong while they're exhibiting pathetic weekness. That's very sad.
What does a new man look like, Harriet? I think, we are seeing you when we were talking earlier, you talked about an old, empty, puffed up way of being a man. Talk about the new regular way of being a man.
The new regular
masculinity isn't necessarily troublesome. It's the toxic masculinity that's a problem.
Right. Well, I think that the new man sees himself primarily as a person, not as a gender.
That's how I always felt as a woman.
Same with me. And as a person wants to connect with other people, wants to believe in the possibilities of what we can do together, and really together without a hierarchy. A real man doesn't need to puff up his strength by finding artificial barriers between himself and others that make him higher, whether they're barriers of race or gender or sex or anything. And capitalism encourages this idea that we shouldn't be together, that we're isolated individuals, but power with is the antidote to the power over strategy of the toxic right-wing hyper-masculinist militias and Donald Trump, who personifies it himself, who doesn't allow anyone else to have a voice around him. Only his voice has to be echoed. That's
not that I was
toxic
a huge
masculinity.
fan here, but I find it interesting that it was easier for our country to elect a black man than it was a woman of any.
Yes, I think that's true. But I also think that part of the reason that these militiamen are acting out with their fake masculinist strength is because their way of life is dying. We have a social service economy. Women and men need to work together. If we're going to have a chance against capitalism, we have to work together. Those gender roles are so outmoded that they're not even being used in a lot of the world that's more advanced than we are. The United States is falling on its knees. China their economy has gone up 4.9% during this pandemic. The United States down 34%. Wow. We're being replaced because of people like this. We have to work together. And I think they are an outmoded cry of hyper-masculinist fake masquerade in a time of the real empowerment of people's connection, which you can see in reaction to this election of two people, one of whom is bizarrely hyper-masculinist and toxic and hyper-capitalist also.
It's so, if we look back in history, I was thinking that these groups are akin to the brown shirts, right? They're the militia groups that
the fascistic
before
brown
the rise
shirts
of the real fascists. Now they're the sleeveless camo Kevlar shirt people, whatever you want to call them. What is it about? It's so interesting how this concept of masculinity and emasculating people from like the society or the economy emasculates people, and then they become open, and we've seen this again and again, to a rising fascism and wanting a fascist leader. Even my grandfather was in World War II. They were poor. He was co-opted by the Italian army to fight. He was a prisoner of war for I don't know how many years, several. I think my dad was 6 or 7 when he met his father for the first time. And I remember him saying, well, you can't have more than one leader, saying like democracy doesn't work. You just need one guy. And I'm like, oh my God, they brainwashed him, you know? And I'm like, don't you know that is what caused the poverty in the first place? You know, it was just,
well, that is an ideology that has to
it's living
change
in my blood, this thing that we're living under.
But you are the exemplar that it doesn't have to continue to live, because the conditions of existence that force is what will make a change are outmoded. Force is what will destroy the world. An atomic force will destroy the world. And as a typical thing, it's important to say that Trump sold our pandemic supplies, because you make money when you turn things over, not when you stockpile them. But they stockpile enough weapons so they have 6 times more weapons than the other 6 or 7 countries that are over weaponized themselves. And that idea of hypermasculinity is tied to force makes right. And that's what makes those militias, who are pathetic, really, and are outmoded.
So much, Harriet. This is a part 2 of our discussion. Part 1 is in an episode before. You mentioned atomic attack. I hope we haven't had one of those. I hope Trump didn't win the election by the time this thing gets out on the internet. And God knows what the unleashed forces of a narcissistic, toxic, masculine person can do. So I hope everyone who's watching is doing well. I forgot to mention this earlier, but we are supported right now by Democracy at Work, who has let us do a once weekly version of this show for 90 days until we can become self-supporting by people who can contribute. So we do ask that if you can contribute, and again, we've said this before, we understand where people are at, and we need you more than we need your money. But if you happen to have a couple of dollars or a lot of dollars, we're not going to say no, to support the continuation of this program. Democracy at Work can't really finance their small group. They do a lot of great work. They can't support us forever. So they're supporting us until we can become self-supporting. Go to our Patreon page, please. It's Patreon. The Patreon website, and then you go to Capitalism Hits Home, and you can make a recurring donation. We really appreciate that. And thank you to the people who have made the donations once hearing our pleas on prior episodes. I appreciate that. Final words, Harriet, as we round out the episode here?
Yes, that just as hypermasculinity pretends they don't need anyone, we do need each other. We need each other to make a sane, kind world, and we need you to help support this program as well, and end the capitalist menace in its latest awful exemplar of Donald Trump and the militias.
Thank you so much for watching. Our Twitter handle is Democracy at WRK, stands for work, but we didn't have room for the O. Democracy at Work without the O. Our Instagram is the same. You can follow me on Twitter at Julianna Forlano, and find Harriet at her website, harrietfraad, FRAAD.com. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, and bye.